A billionaire CEO's unexpected midnight visit to her lonely employee's home changes two lives forever. It is a story that proves a single act of kindness can heal the deepest wounds of being alone. Before we begin, please subscribe and follow our channel. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The winter frost made beautiful patterns on the windows. Each icy design was a silent witness to the loneliness that had become Lawrence Robinson's only friend. It was Christmas night, and the hours were moving closer to midnight. Lawrence lived in a small two-bedroom apartment. But tonight, it felt like a giant, empty cave. In the corner of the room, a cheap artificial tree blinked with tired lights. The colors reflected off the picture frames on the shelf. Those pictures held the ghosts of happier times. One photo showed a smiling woman with dark curls. Another showed a little girl named Maria with a big gap in her teeth, sitting on a swing. That family only existed in those frozen moments now. Lawrence sat perfectly still at his old, scratched dining table. His fingers were wrapped around a mug of tea, but the tea had gone cold an hour ago. The cup held no warmth, just like everything else in his life lately. He stared at the dark liquid and thought about how his world had become so cold. It wasn't one big bad thing that happened. It was a slow loss of joy, drop by drop, until he woke up and realized he was living in the shell of life. Outside, the city of Portland was bundled up against the December cold. Families were gathered around tables full of good food. Children were screaming with joy over their new toys. Couples were sitting by warm fireplaces. But inside apartment 4B, there was only silence and the low hum of the refrigerator. Lawrence was 37 years old, but he felt much older. He worked as a warehouse supervisor at Ripley Logistics. He was a good worker. He was always on time, and he always hit his numbers. But to the company, he was just a name on a payroll list. He felt invisible. He felt like if he disappeared tomorrow, the giant warehouse would just keep moving without a single pause. This Christmas was the hardest one yet. It was the first time his 7-year-old daughter, Maria, wasn't with him. Because of a difficult divorce, Maria was spending the holiday with her mother in another state. Lawrence had tried to be strong. He had decorated the tree and even bought a small gift for himself to put under it. But the effort felt empty. He had called Maria earlier that day. She was happy and excited, telling him about her new dolls. Lawrence had smiled and told her he loved her, but after he hung up the phone, the silence of the apartment felt like it was crushing him. He spent the rest of the day sitting in his chair, watching the snowfall outside. He didn't cook a big dinner. He didn't put on music. He just sat there with his cold tea, counting the minutes until the day was over. He felt like he was failing at everything. He felt like he wasn't a good enough husband to keep his marriage together, and he wasn't a successful enough man to give Maria the life he dreamed of. He was stuck in a cycle of work and sleep, with no hope for anything better. Then, the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. Lawrence decided it was time to give up on the day and go to bed. But just as he stood up, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Knock, knock, knock. It was a firm, clear sound. Lawrence stayed still, his heart beating fast. Who would be knocking at his door at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas night? He thought maybe it was a neighbor with a leak or perhaps a mistake. He walked slowly to the door and looked through the small peephole. He blinked and looked again. He couldn't believe his eyes. Lawrence pulled the door open. The cold air from the hallway rushed in, but he didn't feel it. He was looking at a woman he saw every morning on the company news screen. Standing there was Michelle Ripley. She was the CEO of Ripley Logistics. She was a billionaire and one of the most powerful women in the country. But tonight, she didn't look like a CEO. She wasn't wearing a power suit or expensive jewelry. She was wearing a fitted red silk blouse tied at the waist and a pair of dark blue jeans. Her long, straight black hair was down, and her face looked soft and tired. She was holding a small paper bag from a late-night deli and a single red rose in a glass vase. "Lawrence," she said. Her voice was quiet, not loud and commanding like it was in the office. "I know it is very late. I hope I am not bothering you." Lawrence was so shocked he could barely speak. "Ms. Ripley? What are you doing here? Is something wrong at the warehouse?" Michelle shook her head. She looked into the apartment and saw the small tree and the cold mug of tea on the table. "Nothing is wrong at work, Lawrence. I was driving around the city, and I realized I didn't want to be alone tonight. I looked up your address in the files. I remembered seeing you at the warehouse last week, and I had a feeling you might be alone too." Lawrence felt a rush of emotions. He felt embarrassed that his boss was seeing his small, cheap apartment. He felt confused about why a billionaire would care about a warehouse supervisor. But mostly, he felt a strange sense of relief. Someone had finally seen him. "Please come in," Lawrence said. Stepping back, Michelle walked into the room. She stood in the middle of the small space, looking around. She saw the photos of Maria. She saw the scratches on the dining table. She didn't look at these things with pity. She looked at them with interest. "You have a lovely home, Lawrence," she said softly. "It feels real. My house, it just feels like a giant box of glass and cold stone." Lawrence didn't know what to say. He offered her a seat in his green velvet armchair. It was the best chair he had, even though the fabric was worn thin. Michelle sat down and placed the paper bag and the rose on the table. "I brought some sandwiches," she said. "I thought maybe we could eat together. I didn't want the day to end without talking to a real person." Lawrence sat down across from her. He looked at the powerful woman sitting in his living room, and he realized she was telling the truth. She wasn't there to fire him or to talk about business. She was there because she was just as lonely as he was. The Iron Lady of Ripley Logistics was gone. In her place was a woman who had reached the top of the mountain only to find out there was no one there to hold her hand. Lawrence realized that his boss wasn't a goddess or a machine. She was a human being who was hurting. As they sat there in the glow of the blinking Christmas lights, the silence that had been crushing Lawrence all day began to lift. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a number. He felt like a man. The midnight knock had changed everything. Lawrence didn't know what would happen next, but as he looked at Michelle, he knew that his life would never be the same. The cold tea was forgotten. The frost on the windows didn't seem so dark anymore. This was the beginning of a story about two people from different worlds who found each other in the dark. It was a story about how a simple knock on a door can start a fire that warms even the coldest heart. Lawrence Robinson was no longer a single dad spending Christmas alone. He was a man with a guest, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Lawrence and Michelle sat across from each other at the small, scratched kitchen table. The room was very quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a space where two people were finally safe enough to be honest. Michelle took the single red rose and placed it in the center of the table. Its bright color stood out against the dull, worn-out wood, looking like a small spark of life in the middle of a desert. Michelle opened the bag of sandwiches and pushed one toward Lawrence. She didn't act like a boss giving an order. She acted like a friend sharing a meal. As they began to eat, the conversation started slowly. Lawrence felt a bit shy. He was used to speaking to Michelle only during warehouse meetings where he had to report numbers and shipping times. But tonight, there were no numbers to report. Lawrence decided to be brave. He started to narrate the real story of his life. He told her that he had spent the last 3 years feeling like he was drowning. He talked about how he had lost his wife not to another man, but to the constant stress of their poverty. He explained that his biggest fear every single day was that his daughter, Maria, would grow up remembering her father as a man who was always tired and always sad. "I try so hard to be a hero for her," Lawrence said, his voice shaking a little. "But it is hard to feel like a hero when you are counting pennies for bread and milk. I feel like I am failing her because I cannot give her the world. I feel like I am just a machine that moves boxes, and when I break, I will be replaced by another machine." Michelle didn't look away. She listened to him with a kind of focus that Lawrence had never experienced before. When he finished, she didn't offer him a raise or a lecture. Instead, she took a deep breath and told him her own story. She told him that she had grown up with nothing and had spent her entire life running away from poverty. She thought that as she became the most powerful woman in the industry, she would finally feel safe. She had worked 20-hour days. She had ignored her friends. And she had never allowed herself to fall in love because she thought it was a distraction. "Now I am at the top," Michelle whispered. "I have the money, the cars, and the big house. But I have realized that success without connection is just another form of poverty. I live in a house that is full of beautiful things, but there is no soul in it. I have thousands of employees, yet I had no one to call on Christmas night." She told Lawrence that she had been watching him for a long time. She remembered a day 6 months ago when a new worker had accidentally knocked over a heavy shelf. Everyone else had shouted, but Lawrence had run over, checked that the boy was okay, and spent his own lunch break helping the boy clean up the mess. "I saw that," Michelle said, touching the petal of the red rose. "And I realize that you have something I lost a long time ago. You have humanity. You see people. In my world, everyone is just a tool to get more power, but you see the person. I came here tonight because I wanted to see the man who still knows how to be kind even when he has nothing." Lawrence was stunned. He had no idea that his small acts of kindness were being noticed by someone so high up. He had always thought he was invisible, but Michelle had been paying attention. The conversation lasted for hours. They talked about their childhoods, their favorite books, and the things that made them laugh. For the first time, Lawrence wasn't just a supervisor, and Michelle wasn't just a CEO. They were just two people named Lawrence and Michelle who were tired of being lonely. As they spoke, Lawrence realized that his boss wasn't the iron lady everyone feared. She was a woman who had built a wall of ice around her heart to keep from getting hurt. And tonight, that ice was finally melting. She told him that she wanted to change the company. She wanted Ripley Logistics to be a place where people were valued, not just boxes. "I want you to help me, Lawrence," she said. "I don't want you in the warehouse anymore. I want you by my side. I want to start a program that supports single parents and helps workers who are struggling just like you were. I want you to be the heart of this company." Lawrence felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he didn't even know he was carrying. He realized that the arithmetic of survival was finally over. He wasn't going to have to count pennies anymore. He was going to be able to give Maria the life he had always dreamed of. But more than the money or the job, Lawrence felt a deep sense of peace because he wasn't alone anymore. He looked at Michelle and saw that she was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the city of Portland was waking up to a new day. Michelle stood up to leave, but before she went to the door, she looked back at the small, blinking Christmas tree. "Thank you, Lawrence," she said. "Thank you for opening your door to me." "Thank you for knocking," Lawrence replied. As she drove away, Lawrence stood on his small balcony and watched the snow fall. The apartment didn't feel cavernous anymore. It felt like a home. He looked at the red rose on the table and knew that this was the best Christmas he had ever had. He had started the night as a ghost, but he was ending it as a man with a future. The story of the lonely single dad and the billionaire boss was just beginning, and for the first time in his life, Lawrence Robinson couldn't wait for Monday morning. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens to them. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never another amazing stories from me. Monday morning arrived, but it was nothing like the hundreds of Monday mornings Lawrence had experienced before. Usually, he would wake up with a heavy feeling in his chest, dreading the long hours of counting boxes and managing shipping schedules. But today, he woke up before his alarm went off. He looked at the red rose on his kitchen table, which was still bright and beautiful, and he remembered that the events of Christmas night weren't a dream. When Lawrence arrived at the corporate headquarters of Ripley Logistics, he wasn't wearing his usual warehouse uniform. He had put on his best button-down shirt and trousers. He felt a little nervous as he walked past the glass walls of the executive offices. People looked at him with curiosity. They knew he was a supervisor from the warehouse, and they wondered why he was heading toward the top floor. When he reached the CEO's office, Michelle's assistant smiled and told him to go right in. Michelle was standing by a large window, looking out at the city. She was back in her professional attire, wearing a sharp suit, but when she turned around and saw Lawrence, her face softened. She didn't look at him like a boss looks at a worker. She looked at him like a partner. "Good morning, Lawrence," she said. "Are you ready to change this company?" Michelle spent the morning introducing Lawrence to the board of directors. She told them that the company was going to start a new department called Operations Wellness. She explained that for too long, they had treated their workers like machines. She announced that Lawrence would be the director of this new department because he understood the real-life struggles of the people on the front lines. The other executives were surprised, but Michelle's word was final. For the rest of the day, Lawrence and Michelle sat together and started to build a new blueprint for the company. Lawrence narrated the problems he had seen for years. He told her about the parents who had to choose between staying with a sick child or losing their jobs. He told her about the workers who lived in their cars because they couldn't afford rent. Michelle took notes on everything he said. Together, they designed a system that provided emergency child care, better health benefits, and a hardship fund for families in trouble. Lawrence felt a surge of pride. He wasn't just moving boxes anymore. He was moving lives. He was helping people who felt just as invisible as he had felt only a few days ago. As the weeks went by, Lawrence's life transformed. With his new salary, he was able to move into a bigger, brighter apartment. He fixed the arithmetic of survival that had haunted him for so long. He no longer had to choose between a new pair of shoes for Maria or a bag of groceries. But more importantly, his relationship with Michelle grew deeper. They spent their lunch breaks together, not talking about profits, but talking about the impact they were making. Michelle began to change, too. The workers noticed that she smiled more. She started visiting the warehouse floors just to say hello and ask people about their families. The Iron Lady was gone, replaced by a leader who led with her heart. People started to love working for Ripley Logistics, and for the first time, the company felt like a community. The biggest change, however, happened when Maria came home. When Lawrence picked her up from the airport, he didn't look like the tired, sad man she had left. He looked strong and happy. He took her to their new home and showed her the room he had decorated just for her. Maria was so excited she jumped into his arms, and Lawrence felt a happiness so deep it almost made him cry. One evening, Michelle came over for a casual dinner. She brought a toy for Maria and sat on the floor to play with her. Seeing the most powerful woman in the city laughing with his daughter made Lawrence realize how far they had both come. Michelle wasn't just his boss or his partner in business. She had become a part of his life. They were no longer two isolated souls living in empty houses. They had built a bridge between their worlds. Lawrence realized that his loneliness had been a dark tunnel, but Michelle had been a light at the end of it. And as he watched Michelle and Maria play, he knew that the next Christmas wouldn't be spent alone. It would be spent with the people who saw him, loved him, and made him feel like he finally belonged. 1 year had passed since the midnight knock that changed everything. The frost was once again painting patterns on the window panes of Portland. But this time, the view from the window was very different. Lawrence wasn't sitting in a dark, quiet apartment anymore. He was standing in a spacious, warm living room filled with the smell of pine and roasting turkey. This year, the Christmas tree wasn't small or blinking with tired lights. It was tall and bright, decorated with ornaments that Maria had picked out herself. Maria was no longer hundreds of miles away. She was in the middle of the room, laughing and showing her new toys to Michelle. Lawrence watched them from the kitchen, and he felt a deep sense of peace. His life was no longer a shell. It was full and rich. The company, Ripley Logistics, had changed just as much as Lawrence had. Because of the operations wellness program, the workers were happier and more productive. Lawrence had spent a year traveling to different warehouses, meeting parents, and setting up support systems. He had become a hero to the employees. But he always remained humble. He knew that his success was built on the kindness Michelle had shown him on that lonely night. As the evening went on, Lawrence, Maria, and Michelle sat down for dinner. They shared stories and laughed until their sides ached. There was no talk of metrics or profit margins. There was only the warmth of a family that had been built from two lonely hearts. Lawrence looked at Michelle, who was wearing a red silk blouse similar to the one she wore a year ago. She looked radiant. She had finally found a connection she was looking for, and she wasn't the Iron Lady anymore. She was just Michelle. Later that night, after Maria had fallen asleep with a smile on her face, Lawrence and Michelle stood on the balcony. They watched the snow fall over the city. The lights of Portland sparkled like diamonds. "Thank you, Michelle," Lawrence said quietly, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for knocking on that door when I was ready to give up." Michelle took his hand and looked into his eyes. "And thank you, Lawrence, for opening the door. You didn't just let me into your home. You let me into a world where people actually care about each other. You saved me just as much as I saved you." They stood in the cold air, but they didn't feel the chill. They had each other, and they had a future together. The single red rose from a year ago was gone, but in its place was a love that was blooming in the middle of winter. As the clock struck midnight, marking the end of another Christmas, the lights in their home stayed on, glowing steady and bright. The darkness was gone, and the miracle was just beginning. The most important lesson from this story is that human connection is more valuable than any professional status or financial success. Both Lawrence and Michelle were suffering from a poverty of the soul, one caused by financial struggle and the other by the isolation of power, showing that loneliness does not discriminate based on bank accounts. By choosing to be vulnerable and opening the door, they prove that unexpected act of kindness can bridge the gap between different social classes and heal deep emotional wounds. The story teaches us that true leadership is about seeing the person behind position, and that sometimes the greatest miracle we can receive is simply being noticed and valued by another human being. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing, and then drop in the comment section if you would like part 2. What challenges will they face as a new blended family? Let me know if you want to hear more.